The Andalusian period refers to the Islamic control of Spain from the 8th to the 15th century. Many academics compete to grovel at the feet of their historical caricature of Islam during this period. For a variety of reasons, they lack the courage to deal with the primary source material that exposes the brutality of the Islamic control of Spain. Dr. Dario Fernandez Morera is not one of them. His scholarship is among the most thorough I have encountered, and the aim of this video is to condense some of the content of his book to highlight some significant points, and of course encourage those with a further interest to engage more fully with his work. Let's now turn to some examples of the proud tradition of tolerance we have been assured lies within the record of the primary sources describing life in Islamic Spain. Even several centuries after the Islamic takeover of Spain, segregation was prominent. Dr. Morera quotes Ibn Abdun, "A Muslim must not throw away refuse or clean the latrines of a Jew or Christian. The Jew and Christian are better fitted for such trades, since they are the trades of those who are vile. A Muslim should not attend to the animal of a Jew or a Christian. If any Muslim is known to do this, he should be denounced. The Jews and Christians must be abhorred and shunned, according to Ibn Abdun, and should not be greeted with the formula, peace be with you, for the devil has gained mastery over them and has made them forget the name of God." The 14th century king of Granada, Muhammad ibn Nasr, was praised by historian al-Khatib because he imposed upon the Jewish dhimmis, that is, those subjugated under Islamic rule, the obligation to carry a sign that would make them recognizable and separate, so that they would be easily recognizable as those who were required to pay the tax of humiliation and subjugation known as the jizya. The 11th century poet Abu ibn Ishaq betrays the feelings that the Muslims had for the Jews. They were, quote, "the vilest ape, and they needed to be, quote, put back where they belong, and reduced to the lowest of the low." The poet encouraged Muslims to hasten to slaughter him, that is, the Jews, as an offering. "Sacrifice him, for he is a fat ram, and do not spare his people." The Jews were exiled in several cases. In 1013, for example, they were expelled from Cordoba. The Christians were even less fortunate. They were already a minority under the Umayyads, but when the Almoravids took over, they suffered persecutions and mass expulsions to Africa. In 1099, the great church of the city of Granada was sacked. In 1101, Christians fled from the city of Valencia to the Catholic kingdoms. In 1106, the Almoravids deported Christians to Africa, and in 1126, after a failed Christian rebellion in Granada, the entire city's population was expelled to Africa. Tolerance was so great that by the 12th century, Caliph Yusuf boasted that he had left no church or synagogue standing in all Andalus. Dr. Morera notes, at the end of the 12th century, as a result of the flight to Christian lands, expulsions to North Africa, executions, and conversions, the Christian dhimmi population had largely disappeared from all Andalus. When Christians entered Granada in 1492, there were no Christian dhimmis in the city. Christians and Jews were required to pay the subjugation tax, the jizya. This was a gangster-like protection racket that required the dhimmis to pay for protection or else, and it was quite profitable for the Muslim rulers. The dominant form of jurisprudence in Islamic Spain was the Maliki school of jurisprudence, and Malik's Muwatta declares that the zakat is imposed on the Muslims to purify them and to be given back to their poor, whereas the jizya is imposed on the people of the book to humble them. The jizya was to be paid in the following humiliating manner. Quote, "The dhimmi, standing, would present the money to the Muslim collector, who would be sitting higher up on a sort of throne. This Muslim bureaucrat would hold the dhimmi by the throat, telling him, 'O dhimmi, enemy of Allah, pay the jizya that you owe us for the protection and tolerance we grant you.' The other Muslims present would imitate the collector, pushing around the dhimmi and whoever other dhimmis accompanied him. To this amusing spectacle should be admitted any Muslim who wanted to enjoy it." End quote. Islam's iconoclastic crimes are well documented. Abd al-Rahman I demolished the ancient Basilica of St. Vincent. He then used those materials to build the famous Mosque of Cordoba. According to al-Razi, what Abd al-Rahman did to the Church of St. Vincent was part of the Umayyad rulers' policy of destroying the temples and saintly relics of the polytheists. He would take all the bodies which Christians honor and call saints, and he would burn them, and he would burn their beautiful churches. And in Spain there were many and very magnificent churches, some built by the Greeks and some by the Romans. Seeing this, the Christians, when they could, would take their sacred things and flee to the mountains. Al-Makari confirms that after the conquest, all other churches in and out of Cordoba were immediately pulled down. The Umayyad dictator al-Mansur had precious books of ancient Greek and Latin poetry, lexicography, history, philosophy, and law burned for their presumably impious content. Tolerance wasn't even extended to other Muslims. Blasphemers and apostates were crucified. Quote, "Whoever blasphemes against Allah or his messenger, be he a Muslim or an unbeliever, must be killed, and the opportunity to repent must not be given to him." In Muslim-ruled Toledo, a Muslim man was crucified for blasphemy at the entrance to the city's main bridge. Abd al-Rahman removed a judge for prescribing a punishment less strict than death against a Muslim accused of blasphemy. The ruler then named a new judge who had the impious man suffer the death prescribed by Maliki jurisprudence, crucifixion. While being placed on the cross, the blasphemer shouted that he was innocent and that he did believe, after all, in Muhammad and Allah. This repentance did not stop his crucifixion. Under Abd al-Rahman II, in Islamic Spain, a blasphemer could be both crucified and stabbed on the cross, a curious combination that was in fact proper, according to the Maliki doctrine. The Umayyad rulers Abd al-Rahman II and Muhammad I killed many Christians who had the courage to proclaim the divinity of Jesus and that Muhammad is a false prophet. Dr. Morera notes, although beheading was the preferred method of execution, Muhammad I used other methods as well. The nun Laura, for example, was thrown into a cauldron of molten lead. The old monk Jeremiah was lashed to death, and the young soldier Sancho was impaled. Dr. Morera continues, although most scholars today do not dispute the primary source evidence of the Umayyads' brutal killings of these Christians, they point to the extremism of the martyrs, not of the presumably tolerant Umayyad rulers who ordered their slaughter. They have called these executed Christians fanatics, troublemakers, and self-immolators. As the term suggests, scholars have argued in essence that the Catholics asked for it, by openly doing things clearly punishable by Islam. I would add that such is the sorry state of many leading academics who have made a career out of paying homage to Islam. Just as in 7th century Islam we see sadistic punishments, so in 8th century Islam, Dr. Morera describes Abd al-Rahman's response to an Abbasid invasion from North Africa that he defeated. Quote, according to al-Makari, when the defeated Abbasid general and his officers were brought before Abd al-Rahman, the Umayyad ruler had the man's hands cut off, then their feet, and finally their heads. Then Abd al-Rahman caused labels inscribed with the names of the deceased to be suspended from their ears. Their heads were then stored in sealed bags, together with the black banners of the house of Abbas, and the whole given to a trusty merchant, who was directed to convey his cargo to Mecca and deposit it in public places at a certain time. Caliph Abd al-Rahman III, affectionately described by Robert Hillenbrand as an, quote, energetic and dazzlingly successful monarch, end quote, deserves special attention. As other scholars not bent on concealing the nature of Islamic Spain describe, the, quote, enhanced beheading activity under Abd al-Rahman III was notorious. The Muslim historian Ibn Hayyan gives a description of the caliph's treatment of 100 of the most important Christian prisoners that the caliph had obtained. He positioned himself in an upper balcony over an orchard facing the river to watch the mass execution. All the prisoners, one by one, were decapitated in his presence and under his eyes, in plain sight of the people, whose feelings against the infidels Allah alleviated, and they showered their blessings on the caliph. The death of these barbarians was celebrated in a poem. Quote, defeated, the prisoners arrived, carried and shackled by Allah. Like an angry lion, you looked at them, surrounded by wild lions and dragons, and in plain sight of everyone, your sword annihilated them, among blessings and praises to Allah. End quote. This caliph, praised by Western academics, had a homosexual passion for a 13-year-old male Catholic hostage. Abd al-Rahman III ordered this boy beheaded after repeated tortures because the boy had turned down his sexual advances. One of the caliph's many sex slaves turned down his advances, to which he took a candle to her face, burning and destroying her beauty. The intoxicated caliph ordered the execution of one of his sexual slaves who had offended him. His executioner, whom he always had at the ready with his instruments, said that one night the caliph called him to his room in the palace. The executioner then entered the room and saw the caliph was drinking and found him squatting like a lion on his paws in the company of a girl, beautiful like an oryx, who was held by his eunuchs in the corner of the room, who was asking him for mercy while he answered her in the grossest manner. He then told his executioner, "Take that whore and cut her neck." The executioner procrastinated, asking him again, as was his custom. But he was told again by the caliph, "Cut it, so may Allah cut your hand, or if not, put down your own neck." And the servant brought her close to me, gathering up her braids, so that with one blow I made her head fly. Abd al-Rahman III's tolerance for Christianity was so great, he even had his relative Ibrahim bin Ahmad bin Abd al-Aziz killed for secretly practicing Christianity. The caliph even persecuted any Muslim who followed a legal code other than that of Maliki. Dr. Morera notes this may have been the reason for Abd al-Rahman III's murder of his own son, who had shown a preference for Sufism. That is another school of Islamic jurisprudence. Inquisitions were held, for example, in 952, 956, and 957 to weed out heretics with orders to, quote, persecute them by all means available, send them your spies, and make an effort to know their secrets, and when it is clear that someone belongs to them, write to the caliph a list with their names, locations, names of witnesses against them, and their accusations, so that one may order to have them brought to the gate of Al-Suda and punished in their capital. After the death of Ibn Hafsun, a rebel and apostate to Christianity, Abd al-Rahman III had his cadaver disinterred, crucified, and exposed as a Christian. This is curious because Jane Smith from Harvard Divinity School says that under Abd al-Rahman III, Muslim tolerance of the so-called people of the book, Jews and Christians, was high, and social intercourse was easy and constant. This learned scholar is not quoting history, rather she is fabricating it. Abd al-Rahman III was the caliph who hanged the sons of the blacks from the well of his palace as a sort of counterweight to draw water. Much more on the Islamic view of blacks to come. Abd al-Rahman III's brutality was not unrivaled. Al-Hakam I organized the famous beheadings of the pit, during which he organized a banquet to honor the notable people of Toledo, that is, Christians who had been converted to Islam, who were considered unruly. Through a method of trickery that he had devised, he was able to behead 700 men. The heads were chopped off and the bodies were thrown into a pit that the ruler had prepared. The notorious late 10th century Muslim ruler known as Al-Mansur organized nearly 60 successful jihads and ordered that the dust on his clothes be collected after each expedition against the hated Christians so that he could be buried under that glorious dust when he died. He also burned heretical books and burned down Barcelona in 985, enslaving all those he did not kill. He demolished churches and built mosques with Christians who were in chains, working as imported slaves from infidel countries. He again proved his religious piety by ordering the learned men to do a public book burning of all philosophical works in the Caliphate's library. Al-Andalusi explains, whoever had studied those sciences became regarded as prone to heterodoxy and suspected of heresy. Most of them who until then had studied philosophy now lost their interest in it, became terrified, and kept secret the fact that they knew the subject. Western scholars champion the freedom and equitable treatment of women in Islamic Spain. The Maliki jurists who dominate Islamic Spain disagree. The jurist Ibn Rushd states, quote, "These societies of ours overlook the skills of women because women are only used for procreation. They resemble plants in these societies, turning into a burden for men, which is one of the reasons for the poverty of these communities. Female circumcision was considered an honor for women among the clerics. Slavery, including sexual slavery, was rampant. White slaves, especially blonde ones often captured in raids of Christian lands, were the most prized. In the year 912, during the Islamic Golden Age of the Umayyad Caliphate, a black girl from Nubia went for 300 dinars of gold. A white girl without education cost 1,000 dinars of gold. A white girl with singing abilities cost 14,000 dinars. In Abd al-Rahman III's court, there were, for example, 3,750 slaves. His harem had 6,300 women. and his army included 13,750 slave warriors. A document from the 12th century tells of the tricks used by sellers of slaves in the Muslim slave markets. Merchants would put ointments on slave girls of a darker complexion to whiten their faces. Brunettes were placed for hours in a solution to make them blonde. Ointments were placed on the face and body of black slaves to make them prettier. The merchant would dress the girls in transparent clothes, the white females in pink and the black ones in yellow and red. Western scholars praise the delightful love poetry of Andalusia, oblivious to the fact that it was written about sexual slave girls. Dr. Morera quotes from a Moroccan writer who says, "The harems became places of the greatest luxury, where the most beautiful women of the world played their cultural differences and mastery of diverse skills, and knowledge like winning cards for seducing caliphs and viziers." Ibn Hazm commented on these women's total dedication to sexual conquests as the underlying reason for their various skills. He says, quote, "As for the reason why this instinct, the preoccupation with sexual matters, is so deeply rooted in women, I see no other explanation than that they have nothing else to fill their minds, except loving union and what brings it about, flirting and how it is done, intimacy, and the various ways of achieving it. This is their sole occupation, and they were created for nothing else." In a grotesque display of mental gymnastics, Dr. Morera notes that some ingenious academic specialists have argued that by permitting slave girls to learn skills that increased their sexual attractiveness, it actually promoted women's liberation. An article published in the New York Times has likened the sexual slaves conniving for power in the harem to the struggles of Western women in the corporate world. Dr. Morera cannot avoid sarcasm when he responds to these reprehensible statements. He says, quote, "One can certainly imagine the throngs of girls and boys in Greece, Serbia, and Central Asia clamoring to be taken away from their families, to be circumcised, to become sexual slaves, or to be castrated, to guard harems as eunuchs, or in other cases, to be raised in barracks with the sole purpose of becoming fearless slave soldiers." Moving from sexual slaves to slaves in general, it is well known among proper students of history, as Dr. Morera notes, quote, "In fact, Islamic warriors pioneered the slavery of African blacks," end quote. Why were blacks prime for the slave trade? According to the 11th century Andalusian jurist, for those people, on the other hand, who live near and beyond the equator to the limit of the inhabited world in the south, the long presence of the sun at the zenith makes the air hot and the atmosphere thin. Because of this, their temperatures become hot and their humors fiery, their color black and their hair woolly. Thus they lack self-control and steadiness of mind and are overcome by fickleness, foolishness, and ignorance. Such are the blacks who live at the extremity of the land of Ethiopia, the Nubians, the Zanj, and the like. Dr. Morera correctly notes that such views of black Africans in the medieval Islamic Empire were not confined to Al-Andalus. A 10th century Muslim historian writes that blacks were overcooked by the sun, and therefore, quote, "overdone in the womb until they are burned, so that the child comes out something between black, murky, malodorous, stinking, and crinkly-haired, with uneven limbs, deficient minds, and depraved passions." An Arab proverb states that the black, when hungry, steals; sated, he fornicates. Dr. Morera continues to note that the trade in white slaves was not far behind that of black slaves. From the 1530s to the 1780s, it is estimated that in Islamic lands between 1 million and 1.25 million white slaves were traded, taken from the Mediterranean coast, Greece, the Balkans, Armenia, Persia, and Slavic lands, among other places. The 10th century geographer Ibn Hakwal observed that one of the main exports of Al-Andalus was slaves. I'll end with the citations from Dr. Morera's work at this point, though much more could be said. To conflate some quotations previously given, I hope you enjoyed this energetic and dazzling look into the long tradition of tolerance exemplified in Islamic Spain.